An example of when the lactic acid system would be used is in a 400-metre run. This is because it's got a moderate intensity and has a moderate duration. A 400-metre run would last roughly around 1 minute. The lactic acid system can provide energy for roughly around 3 minutes. The fibres that would be used in moderate intensity and duration would be fast oxidative glycolytic. This is because they are between fast glycolytic and slow oxidative fibres, meaning that they are the best for moderate duration events. They have the characteristics of both fast glycolytic and slow oxidative fibres. The speed of contraction is moderate in fast oxidative glycolytic as they hold a reasonable amount of glycogen. A greater amount of glycogen the fibre contains, the faster the speed of contraction. Fog fibres hold a lot more than slow oxidative fibres, but less than fast glycolytic fibres. The rate of fatigue is moderate, but the force of contraction would be high. So for a 400-metre sprint, fast oxidative glycolytic fibres would enable the sprint to be quite fast, but not completely flat out. The waste products from using the lactic acid system are harmful. The main waste product produced is lactic acid. This is a major disadvantage of using this system, as when lactic acid builds up, it can lead to muscle pain and fatigue. The energy sources providing the lactic acid system with fuel is all carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the only energy source which is providing the lactic acid system with energy. The carbohydrates are glycogen and glucose. Glycogen is broken down by the process of anaerobic glycolysis. RER is the respiratory exchange ratio. The RER refers to the quantity of carbon dioxide made by the muscles as a waste product compared to the amount of oxygen that is used. The RER gives us an indication of what fuel sources, fat, protein and carbohydrates, are being used. During exercise, we require 3 different fuel sources. At different intensities and durations, different fuel sources will be relied upon. When we are using the lactic acid system, the only fuel source providing the energy is carbohydrates. Glycogen and glucose, which are both carbohydrates, are supplying the energy. Anaerobic glycolysis is a process in which ATP is broken down by the lactic acid system to make energy. Glycogen is broken down into glucose, and then glucose is broken down into pyruvic acid. This process makes energy to supply the athlete to enable them to work or to keep up the work intensity. The depletion of carbohydrate stores such as glycogen and glucose in the muscle or liver is one of the main causes of fatigue. This is because glycogen is one of the main fuel sources which is responsible for the ATP resynthesis. Glycogen is used to break down ATP and stick the P back on. The depletion of glycogen as a major source of ATP production will then no longer exist, so therefore this results in muscular fatigue. Glycogen depletion occurs at different rates, based on the intensity of the exercise being carried out. A 400-metre sprinter will use glycogen much faster than a marathon runner would. The restoration of glycogen in a moderate intensity and moderate duration activity would take roughly around a day. The glycogen recovery process can be sped up by consuming carbohydrate-loaded drinks straight away after the exercise. From using the aerobic system, lactic acid is produced. In a 400-metre run, lactic acid would be accumulating. The lactic acid is produced in anaerobic exercise. Lactic acid starts to build up and accumulates in the muscle and eventually leads to fatigue. When it starts to build up, the body tries to clear it but can't. The lactic acid in the muscle increases the acidity that can lead to glycolytic enzymes being inhibited, meaning that they stop working. This results in the lactic acid system not being able to be used anymore, and then the aerobic system has to be used instead. After high-intensity exercise, lactic acid accumulates in the blood, which can be one of the main causes of fatigue. Hydrogen ions are released as a result from the breakdown of ATP for energy. Hydrogen dissociates from the lactic acid, and the build-up, this is what causes the pain, feelings and fatigue from the build-up of hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions is the acid in the lactic acid. The hydrogen ions which are left over increase the acidity in the muscles, causing the pH to decrease and get lower. The decrease in pH inhibits the glycolytic enzymes and stops them from working. Acidosis is an increased acidity in the blood, which can be due to an increase in hydrogen ion concentration in the blood plasma. The pH of the blood decreases and becomes more acidic as a result of lactic acid production increasing. When the pH gets very low, muscles are affected. The body doesn't like acidic conditions, and eventually the increased acidity results in exercise having to be stopped. OBLA stands for the onset of blood lactate accumulation. It is the point at which the lactic acid starts to accumulate in the muscles. As we work, the intensity increases and lactic acid begins to accumulate. OBLA is when the lactate accumulation starts to cause muscle pain and fatigue. This eventually leads to the performance decreasing due to the conditions in the body being too acidic, causing enzymes to be inhibited. OBLA is always measured at 4 millimoles of lactate. So on this graph in front of here, 4 millimoles of lactate, if you look along, so on this graph, the OBLA would be 3.387 millimoles of lactate. This is taken from a lactate threshold test we did at a uni, and this is showing the blood lactate profile. So OBLA is always measured at 4 millimoles of lactate, and trained athletes reach OBLA at a later stage, meaning that they can work for a longer period of time before the lactate starts accumulating. Trained athletes also begin OBLA at a higher work intensities than untrained athletes. The longer an athlete can delay the blood lactate accumulating, the longer they can work for. The performance decreases when there's a build-up of lactic acid, hydrogen ions, decreased pH, and the depletion of glucose and glycogen. All of these factors lead or result in muscular fatigue. There are ways to delay the build-up of lactic acid or reduce the acidity to stop the factors affecting performance so much. The longer an athlete works for and the higher the intensity, the more these factors affect the performance. Fatigue can be affected by soda loading. It involves drinking sodium bicarbonate minutes before the event. In moderate exercise, when the lactic acid starts to build up, soda loading helps to reduce fatigue. Soda loading is an attempt to neutralize the lactic acid that accumulates in the blood. It increases the amount of bicarbonate in the blood, making it alkaline and therefore increasing the anaerobic endurance. Because at the moment with lactic acid it makes the blood acidic, and so by taking the bicarbonate it's making it alkali instead. So by consuming sodium it would mean that the athlete would be able to train at higher intensities and for longer durations, because the sodium would delay the increase of lactic acid levels. The sodium bicarbonate would make the conditions less acidic and slow down the rise of the pH levels. Although it's ineffective at enhancing performance, there are side effects. Some side effects include an upset stomach, vomiting, and diarrhea. The lactate threshold test is an example of when the lactic acid system would be used. The individual works in 3-minute stages, which is the length of time the lactic acid system can provide energy for before the aerobic system is used. The blood lactate is measured at the end of each stage. Blood lactate is lactic acid that appears in the blood. This is due to the individual working anaerobically. The lactate threshold test isn't very high intensity compared to the 400-meter sprint. The 400-meter sprint is also an example of when the lactic acid system would be used. A lot more lactic acid would accumulate and be produced during a 400-meter sprint compared to a lactate threshold test. As in a 400-meter sprint, the intensity would be a lot higher. For a 400-meter sprint, the fitness level of an individual would need to be very high, as it requires a lot of force and power to be generated, and also a bit of stamina, as it's a long time to sprint for. Whereas for the lactate threshold test, it wouldn't require the same level of fitness, as it's not quite as a high intensity. After completing the lactate threshold test, the timescale required to recover would take anywhere from a couple of hours to 1 or 2 days. Any lactate that has accumulated in the muscles need to be removed. This can take from hours up to days, depending on the intensity, duration, and fitness level of the individual. The oxygen deficit size after completing moderate intensity and duration exercise would be very high. It would be higher than for maximal intensity and short duration because it is working anaerobically for a longer period of time, so the oxygen deficit is building up more. When using the lactic acid system, the body is working anaerobically, meaning that no oxygen is present. This means that the oxygen deficit would become greater, as it would need more oxygen to recover, because the oxygen the body needed but couldn't get needs to be replaced. After a 400-meter sprint, more oxygen would be needed in the recovery stage than a long distance run, because in a long distance run, it's the aerobic system is dominant, so oxygen is being used, so oxygen is already being provided to the body. The oxygen depth from using the lactic acid system would be very big as well, the largest out of all the systems. This is because working anaerobically creates a greater oxygen depth, so the longer the body works anaerobically for, the greater the depth, because the body isn't getting oxygen. The lactic acid system works anaerobically, so we'd be creating a huge oxygen depth as the duration is moderate. The depth would be greater from using the lactic acid system than from using the PC to ATP system, as the time working anaerobically is greater, so less oxygen is available for a longer amount of time, making the depth bigger. So more oxygen is needed for the recovery stage, as there would be a temporary shortage of oxygen during the period of exercise. The metabolic demands from using the lactic acid system in the moderate intensity and duration would be mainly oxygen, because using the lactic acid system is anaerobic. The amount of oxygen required would be high. The oxygen would be needed for the muscles, such as heart and respiratory muscles. Oxygen would also be needed to keep the breathing rate and tidal volume elevated, and a couple of other things which I have spoken about in the aerobic system, which is the same for the lactic acid system. So after moderate intensity and moderate duration exercise, the alactic stage of recovery is used. This stage is mainly responsible for the replenishment of myoglobin and hemoglobin stores. It also replenishes ATP and PC stores, which are used at the beginning of the 400-meter run, while the lactic acid system is preparing to be used. The alactic stage replenishes the ATP and PC store and the myoglobin and hemoglobin in the first 3 minutes of finishing the event. So once the event is finished, this is the alactic component, which is used straight away in the recovery and takes around 3 minutes. So myoglobin is a protein which is located in the muscles. Myoglobin is responsible for carrying oxygen molecules to the muscles. When the oxygen is bound to the myoglobin, it's called oxymyoglobin. Hemoglobin is also a protein located in red blood cells. It is also responsible for associating to 4 pairs of oxygen and transporting that oxygen to places in the body where oxygen is being used up. After the lactic acid system has been used for the 400-meter event, the myoglobin and hemoglobin needs to be replenished. The alactic stage of recovery is responsible for the replenishment of myo and hemoglobin. For the replenishment of them, it uses half a litre of oxygen. Myoglobin and hemoglobin are both replenished by receiving more oxygen. So any oxygen that has been borrowed or disassociated from the myo and hemoglobin will be given back in the replenishment stage, resulting in them both being full up, as they will be holding 4 pairs of oxygen each, which is the most that they can transport and hold. The lactacid stage of recovery occurs after moderate intensity and duration exercise. It takes a longer amount of time than the alactic stage to achieve its goals. This stage is mainly responsible for the removal of lactic acid, replenishing muscle glycogen stores, maintaining ventilation and the body temperature. This all requires around 5 to 8 litres of oxygen. After the 400-metre race, in which the lactic acid system has been used, the first stage in recovery would be using the alactic stage. Then once it's finished, after around 3 minutes, the lactic acid stage can then do its job. Depending on the work intensity of the exercise, the lactic acid stage can take from minutes up into hours. The lactic acid that has built up is removed from the body either in the blood, it's oxidized to make carbon dioxide and water, it's excreted from the body as sweat or urine, or finally it's converted into muscle, glycogen, glucose and protein, but I'll talk more about it later. First of all, the lactic acid reacts with oxygen, and the lactic acid is converted back into pyruvate acid. Then it is turned into the acetyl-CoA enzyme, where it can enter the Krebs cycle. The lactic acid is then converted into water and carbon dioxide. 60% of the lactic acid is converted into water and carbon dioxide, and the other 40% is converted back into glycogen. The lactic acid can be converted into in the liver to glycogen, and then stored in the muscle or liver. In the lactic acid stage, the breathing rate is very gradually lowered. However, it does have to remain reasonably high and elevated, as it needs to be still delivering lots of oxygen to muscles and removing carbon dioxide. DOMS stands for the delayed onset of muscle soreness. DOMS is to do with the tender and painful muscles, which are often experienced after heavy exercise. Usually DOMS occurs after 48 hours. Muscle soreness occurs due to the damage of muscle fibres and connective tissues surrounding the fibres. After around 2 days, the muscle soreness has cleared. This is because the muscle fibres will be repairing themselves. The best way to reduce the effects of DOMS is to warm up before an event and after the event to do a cool down. An active cool down allows the muscles to receive oxygenated blood, which helps prevent the effects of lactate and therefore makes the recovery faster. Pain receptors are stimulated when the muscle protein is broken down. This causes the inflammation. There are many different strategies to aid the recovery time and aid and reduce the recovery time. Some include warming up, cooling down, and nutrition. I'm going to be talking about how they all affect the recovery and how they kind of aid it and try and reduce the recovery time. So by warming up, this is a great way to speed up the recovery. Warming up before events means that there is an early increase in the amount of oxygen being delivered to the muscles. This therefore means that at the end of the event and during the recovery period, the oxygen deficit will be minimised. Oxygen deficit is the amount of oxygen the body wanted but couldn't take on board. How much of the effort was anaerobic, basically. If the oxygen deficit is minimised, this means that the body would have taken on board and used more oxygen. A cool down or active recovery is the next strategy which can speed up the recovery process. So a cool down at the end of a marathon increases, or any long distance or any event. So the cool down at the end of an event, for example, a marathon or 400 meters or any event, increases the oxygen delivery to the tissues, and so therefore increases and speeds up the fast and slow components of epochs, the alactic and the lactate acid stages, because more oxygen is being supplied and provided. Also, the extra oxygen means that the ATP store can be replenished quicker, basically. Furthermore, the cool down keeps the muscles working, allows lactic acid to be removed from the muscles, and for venous return, such as skeletal muscle pump, which is working, is key for circulating blood around the body to the heart. And then finally, nutrition. So it's an important strategy for recovery. This is because it's an effective diet before, during, and after the marathon or 400 meters or 100 meters can delay the fatigue and speed up the recovery process. It will minimize the amount of time needed to recover. For example, eating the correct foods such as carbohydrates, glycogen, glucose, and protein can give energy and help with the recovery process.